Focusing on the contexts of the poor and the marginalized, liberation theology reinterprets religion as a tool to challenge oppression, to speak truth to power. That's what liberation theology is all about. But this paper is not Liberation Theology 101. It's not an intro to the field. It's more specific than that. This paper addresses a critique coming from Indigenous and Native circles of a popular paradigm within Christian liberation theology. I'm going to begin by outlining that critique. I'm going to paint a picture for you, and then I'm going to provide an Islamic perspective focusing on the Qur'an. And I'm going to conclude by reflecting on the state of the art in Islamic liberation theology. Theology is how we conceive of God, and the conception of God, the nature, the character of God is absolutely central to liberation theology. God is conceptualized as an utterly just deity. In fact, not only is God just, but more than that, God is in solidarity with the oppressed and at war with their oppressor. This is a deity who refuses to remain neutral in a context of oppression. This is a deity who gets their hands messy and actively takes the side of the weaker party. And for liberation theologians, that preferential choice is traditionally captured in the liberation of the ancient Israelites from Pharaoh. This is a God who witnesses the suffering of the Israelites under Pharaoh's brutal regime and brings forth their liberation. To quote from the book of Exodus, "I have seen the miserable state of my people in Egypt. I have heard their appeal to be free of their slave drivers. Yes, I am well aware of their sufferings. And now the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have witnessed the way in which the Egyptians oppressed them." End quote. Through the prophetic leadership of Moses and countless miracles, divine acts of resistance, God allows the Israelites to escape Egyptian bondage. The Exodus paradigm emerged right from the beginning of liberation theology, back in the 60s. You can see it in the work of leading Latin American liberation theologians, such as Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff, in Peru and Brazil, respectively. You can see it in the work of the Minjung theologians of South Korea, and you can see it in the Black theology of James Cone in the US. Black theology emerged within the African American community in the 1960s, and it reread Christianity in the context of white supremacy. Given the US context of slavery, the Exodus naturally became a central motif in Black theology, emphasizing a just God who is in solidarity with the enslaved and at war with their slave drivers. So the Exodus was there right from the beginning of liberation theology, and it continues to be an influential paradigm to this day. But the Exodus has also been critiqued by Indigenous scholars, specifically the Native American Robert Warrior and the Palestinian Edward Said. They approach this story from a very different angle, as members of Indigenous communities who have been and who continue to be oppressed by settler colonial regimes. In the case of Warrior, the USA, and in the case of Said, the State of Israel. Warrior and Said argue that if you read the Exodus story through quote-unquote Canaanite eyes, this story isn't about liberation or empowerment or freedom. That would be a selective reading of the story. The Exodus narrative is also about conquest and dispossession. Specifically, they point to the Israelite conquest of Canaan. According to the biblical narrative, God instructs the liberated Israelites who have now left Egypt to take the promised land, the land of Canaan, and to destroy the indigenous inhabitants. Quote, "In the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. Deuteronomy 20, 16 to 17. So in the narrative, this isn't just a massacre. It's a divinely sanctioned massacre. This is what the God of Israel wants, what he demands from his quote-unquote chosen people. The book of Joshua documents how the Israelite forces sacked one city after another, wiping out the indigenous inhabitants. And once this process of destruction is complete, the 12 tribes, under Joshua's leadership, divide the land between them, with 9.5 tribes, quote-unquote, inheriting in the west bank of the River Jordan, and 2.5 tribes inheriting in the east bank. So Warriors and Saeed's critique is not some marginal criticism. It is a major challenge to the Exodus paradigm. It exposes a glaring contradiction within it. And this contradiction has fundamental theological consequences, as the God of the oppressed now becomes, in effect, the God of the oppressor. So the very heart of liberation theology, the assumption that I talked about God's nature as being essentially just, the heart of liberation theology was shaken vis-a-vis this critique. It problematized the whole paradigm. The conquest of Canaan has also taken on a contemporary life of its own. It's also had lasting colonial implications. This narrative has been used to justify European empire and genocide throughout the world, such as in South Africa in the 18th century, South America in the 16th century, and occupied Palestine in the 20th century. It says something that the very first epic poem written in the American colonies was called The Conquest of Canaan. Composed by Reverend Timothy Dwight, who would later become president of Yale College, the poem portrays England as Pharaoh, the American colonies as Israel, and the indigenous inhabitants as, quote, wolfish, fiendish Canaanites. Indeed, it was commonplace in the early colonial American period to refer to Native American peoples as Canaanites and Amalekites. So that's the picture that I painted for you. And this is where I come in as a Muslim liberation theologian. The Exodus has also been a key paradigm in Islamic liberation theology, most notably in the work of the South African scholar Farid Ishaq. You can also see Quranic verses about the Exodus in the opening pages of Sherman Jackson's 2 books on Islamic Black theology. Indeed, in the Qur'an as a whole, Moses and the Israelites are major protagonists. The text devotes an extensive amount of space to the Israelite prophets, and Moses is actually the most mentioned prophet in the Quranic text. His name surfaces about 140 times. Conversely, Fir'aun, is the most vilified human figure in the Quran, personifying oppression and injustice. But going back to Warriors and Saeed's critique of the Exodus, I couldn't help but wonder, what does the Quran itself have to say about the conquest of Canaan? Does it mirror the biblical narrative? Are the Israelites instructed to attack the indigenous inhabitants of the land? Did a mass genocide take place? And if so, was this genocide divinely sanctioned? In sum, is the Exodus paradigm used in a Muslim liberative context also a contradiction? Is it also problematic? So these are the research questions that framed my study of the Quranic text. Having analyzed that text, this paper presents my findings. First, the word Canaan, or Canaan in Arabic, the word Canaan doesn't appear in the Quran. The Quran simply uses the term the Holy Land, al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. It's not a major point, but language matters And so this is the terminology that I will use. Secondly, and more significantly, there's a critical difference in the Quranic representation of the Holy Land as, quote-unquote, the promised land. In the Hebrew Bible, God makes an explicit primordial promise to Abraham. He says that he will give the land of Canaan to Abraham's offspring. Genesis 12, 5-7. At a later point in Genesis, God repeats this promise to Abraham, but this time, God describes a considerably larger stretch of land, extending, quote, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, end quote, modern-day Iraq. Genesis 15, 17-18. And that is why the Israelites, as the children of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, refer to Canaan as the promised land. So this is a primordial promise made to a group, qua group, a group as a group, the Israelites as Israelites. Abraham, or Ibrahim, is also a major figure in the Qur'an, and Allah has a lot to say about this great prophet. Abraham is constantly praised as a beloved servant, a devout prophet, and indeed a paragon of faith. Indeed, Abraham's title is Khalilullah, the friend of Allah. But nowhere in the Quran is Abraham promised the Holy Land. Instead, Allah vows to make Abraham an imam, a leader of humankind. And when Abraham asks if this promise extends to his offspring, Allah clarifies that it will only include those who are not oppressors, al-Zalimin. Chapter 2, verse 124. So in the Quran, there is not a primordial Abrahamic promise made to the Israelites as a group. There's no promise made to the Israelites as Israelites. If you look at the Quranic statements concerning land, they are all addressed to a particular context of oppression in a particular historical moment, namely Pharaonic domination and Israelite suffering. So it's not simply the Israelites, but the battered Israelites, the fleeing Israelites, who are assured that the land is kataba, written for them. Chapter 28, verses 5-6 are a classic example of such a statement. And this passage is probably the most influential Quranic passage in Islamic liberation theology. Quote, "It is our will to bestow our grace upon the downtrodden of the earth, and to make them the leaders, and to make them the inheritors of the earth, and to establish them securely on the earth, and to let Pharaoh and Haman, his main advisor, and their hosts experience through them, the Israelites, the very thing against which they sought to protect themselves," end quote. And now we get to the third and the most significant point. The conquest of Canaan doesn't exist in the Quran. Like the primordial promise made to Abraham, the conquest of Canaan is a distinctly biblical trope. The Quran actually has very little to say about the Israelite encounter with the Holy Land. There is a manifest silence to the text, and we're basically given, as readers, 2 snapshots of that encounter. And the first snapshot is found in chapter 5, verses 20-26. This takes place shortly after the Exodus. The Israelites have escaped Pharaoh's Egypt. They've spent time at Mount Sinai. They've received the revelations, and they've journeyed on to the edge of the Holy Land. And at this point, Allah instructs them to enter the land. He tells them to enter the land, and the Israelites refuse. They refuse. They discern that a mighty people inhabit the land, and they adamantly refused to enter it. Allah is enraged, and He punishes them by making them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Quote, "When Moses said to his people, 'O my people, enter the Holy Land which God has written for you, and do not turn your backs, or you will become losers.' They said, 'O Moses, They are a mighty people in it. We will not enter it until they leave it. But once they leave it, we will go in. They said, O Moses, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. We will be sitting right here. He, Moses, said, My Lord, I have no power over anyone except myself and my brother, so part us from the transgressing lot. He, God, said, It shall be forbidding them for 40 years. They shall wander about in the earth, so do not grieve for the transgressing lot. End quote. Now, at first glance, as a comparative reader between the Qur'an and, in this case, the Hebrew Bible, this Quranic snapshot sounds very similar to the narrative of the spies found in the book of Numbers. In the biblical narrative, the Israelites are ordered to invade Canaan and to attack the indigenous inhabitants. Observing the strength of the indigenous inhabitants, the Israelites are filled with fear and adamantly refuse God's command. And as a result, they are condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But it's important to look at the precise wording of the Qur'an. What exactly does the text say? This is the command that Moses gives to the Israelites. Ya qawmi udkhulu al-ard al-muqaddasa. O my people, enter the Holy Land. Note that the language here is simply one of entrance. Udkhulu, enter, is the imperative, the command form of the noun dukhul, entrance. Entrance, in and of itself, doesn't carry connotations of violence. Furthermore, the notion of fighting, qital, is introduced by the Israelites, not by Allah or His Prophet. Here is how the Israelites respond to Moses, quote, O Moses, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. فَإِذْهَبْ أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ فَقَاتِلًا. We will be sitting right here. Chapter 5, verse 24. In other words, the Israelites make a critical assumption. They assume that entering the land must entail attacking the local inhabitants of that land. To enter is to attack, and vice versa. But the Quranic text itself makes no such equation. It simply commands the Israelites to enter, udkhul. Essentially, this passage is a test of faith. Allah is ordering the Israelites to enter the land, and to enter the land in full view of the manifest strength of its local inhabitants. Do the Israelites genuinely believe in Allah? Do they genuinely believe in Allah's protection, especially given all the miracles they've already seen Allah perform in Pharaonic Egypt? The locals of the land are clearly strong, but why should such strength lead to something negative? Why should such strength lead to antagonism and hostility? Why are assumptions being made about the indigenous other in the first place? Perhaps the locals will welcome the Israelites, battered slaves who are fleeing authoritarian Egypt, and offer them hospitality, taking them into their homes and giving them sanctuary. So that's the first assumption that the Israelites make, that entrance, dukhul, is synonymous with fighting, qital. But they also make another critical assumption. They assume that only one group can live in the land, an ascendant group, a dominating group. The possibility of actually co-inhabiting the land, the indigenous people as the respected locals, they as sanctuaried refugees and migrants, that possibility is inconceivable in their us versus them thinking. To put it another way, the Israelites assume that since the land is written for them, it must only be written for them. It's either or. The land cannot be written for multiple peoples simultaneously. Notice how binary their thinking is. Quote, we will not enter it until they leave it. And once they leave it, we will go in. And again, quote, we will never enter it so long as they remain in it. Go ahead, you and your Lord, and fight. فَإِذْهَبْ أَنْتَ وَرَبُّكَ فَقَاتِلَا. So that's the first Quranic snapshot. It's a test of faith, and the Israelites fail the test. As punishment, they're condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. This brings us to the second snapshot. This snapshot fast forwards into the future. It fast forwards to the Israelites' actual entry into the Holy Land 40 years later. And this snapshot is captured in two Quranic passages that are almost identical. Chapter 2, verses 58 to 59, and chapter 7, verses 161 to 162. Here is the wording of the first passage. And when we said, enter this town, and eat freely when you wish, and enter at the great gate prostrating, and say relief, that we may forgive your mistakes, and we will increase the doers of good. But those who oppressed changed the words with other than what they were told. So we've sent down on those who oppressed a punishment from the sky because of the transgressions they used to commit. Chapter 2, verses 58 to 59. In this second snapshot, there are a number of themes that stand out. A, the Israelites are not commanded anywhere in the passage to attack the local inhabitants. Just like the first snapshot 40 years prior, the Arabic verb is simply udkhulu, enter. In the case of chapter 7, verses 161 to 162, the verb that is used is uskunu, dwell, dwell in the land. The noun form of uskunu is sukun, living, dwelling. And it's worth noting here that sukun also means tranquility, to attain peace of mind. Clearly, none of these terms carry connotations of violence. B, the Israelites are ordered to enter the gate prostrating, sujjadan, and to ask for relief and forgiveness. In other words, according to the Qur'an, the Israelite entry into the Holy Land is meant to be humble, it's meant to be pious, and it's meant to be meek. This is a very different image from the triumphalist parade of an arrogant conquering force. This isn't the entrance of an imperial warrior, but a humble servant. C, the snapshot tells us that a group of Israelites apparently changed God's words and acted in an oppressive manner, but explicitly referred to in the passage as, quote, those who oppressed, alladhina zalamu. What precisely they said, and what precisely they did, we don't know. There's a silence to the narrative. But their actions were apparently so severe that they resulted in a swift punishment from the heavens. So this is what the Qur'an itself has to say about the Israelite encounter with the Holy Land. Nowhere in the text does God command the Israelites to attack the indigenous people. Clearly, manifestly, the Quranic account is different from the Hebrew Bible one, in which God explicitly commands the Israelites to destroy the local inhabitants, to, quote, save alive nothing that breathes, end quote. To go back to Warriors and Said's critique, the Exodus paradigm clearly has problems in terms of Christian liberation theology. There is a manifest contradiction between the Israelite liberation from Egypt on the one hand and the Israelite genocide of the Canaanites on the other. Warrior and Said's critique was a major setback for liberation theology, and rightly so. It was a sound decolonial critique. But as I have shown, that contradiction doesn't exist in the Quranic account. Read through quote-unquote Canaanite eyes, the Quranic Exodus actually holds. That is to say, the account is compatible with anti-colonial politics, with a liberationist commitment to opposing empire, in particular, settler colonialism. And that, I argue, is a progressive development not only for Islamic liberation theology, but for the wider field of liberation theology as a whole. I want to conclude this paper with a point of clarification and a point of significance. Let's start with the clarification. My aim in this paper is not to deliver a polemic against the Bible, and at the same time, to conveniently put my own scripture on a hermeneutical pedestal, to show how great and pristine the Qur'an really is. On the contrary, as a Muslim, I have been deeply inspired by the Bible, in particular the Synoptic Gospels. Let me give you a concrete lived example. Like many Muslims around the world, every Ramadan, I read the whole Qur'an front to back. And a few years ago, I decided to be a naughty Muslim and to read the New Testament instead. So I divided it into 30 parts and read one part, one juz'ah, for each night of Ramadan. Without question, this was one of the most fulfilling spiritual Ramadans I ever had. Through the Gospels, I felt a deep sense of connection to my beloved prophet, Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary, and in particular, his social commitment to the poor, the neglected, and the outcast of his society. In terms of following Prophet Jesus' sunnah as a Muslim, it was the Gospel accounts that showed me the way. But while this paper is no polemic, it does show how problematic and messy the relationship can be between the Bible and the Qur'an. For the Bible has profoundly shaped Muslim understandings of their scripture. Despite the fact that the conquest of Canaan doesn't exist in the Quranic account, that conquest is taken as a given in the tafsir tradition, in the 1,000-year-old tradition of Quranic commentary. You can see it in the tafsir of Abu Ja'far al-Tabari in the 9th century. You can see the conquest in the tafsir of Ismail ibn Kathir in the 14th century. You can see it in the tafsir Jalalain, the tafsir of the two Jalals, Jalaluddin al-Mahalli and Jalaluddin al-Suyuti in the 14th and 15th centuries. And you can even see it in modern day tafsir. In Abu al-Ala Mawdudi's commentary of the Qur'an, Tafhim al-Qur'an, he has pages and pages of quotes directly from the book of Numbers in order to understand the conquest of Canaan in the Qur'an. And he died in 1979 in Pakistan. And the conquest of Canaan is there in the tradition, pre-modern and modern, because all of these Quranic commentators drew on biblical literature, what in Islamic studies we would call Isra'iliyat, in order to understand and expound the Quranic text. So, Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, the Thomas Aquinas of the tafsir tradition, interprets chapter 5, verses 20 to 6. This is the first Quranic snapshot as, quote, the command of Allah to fight the mighty people. Amar Allah fi qital al-jabbarin. And to, quote, attack them in their land. وَهُجُومِهِمْ عَلَيْهِمْ فِي أَرْضِهِمْ. Tafsir al-Tabari, volume 3, page 67. That is how, arguably the most authoritative commentator of the Quran, interprets the verses. Even though the words qital, fighting, and hujum, attack, are never used in the Quranic text itself. And I think that that biblical narrative of conquest spoke to Quranic commentators. It appealed to Quranic commentators because they themselves existed within an imperial Muslim context. And this is a really important point. It's important to appreciate that the Quran was revealed in a pre-imperial era. The revelation ends in 632 CE with the prophet's death. But the tafsir tradition emerges in a very different social context. Significantly, this context is a post-Umayyad context, which saw the rise of a massive global Muslim empire and the radical expansion of Islam's geographic boundaries and, by extension, Islam's material wealth and capital. So that's the first point of clarification that I want to make. While this is no polemic against the Bible, clearly, when it comes to indigenous rights and indigeneity, the Old Testament wording is problematic in a way that the Quranic wording actually isn't. We can cogently reconcile a liberationist commitment to indigenous rights with the Quranic account. And that's why the title of this presentation is Decolonizing Qur'an, where I see the Quranic text not as an object that needs to be decolonized, but as a hermeneutical subject that can allow us to decolonize how Canaan and its indigenous inhabitants had been written into the Islamic tradition in general, and how they had been written into the tafsir tradition in particular. And this brings me to my last and final point, the point of significance. And here I want to zoom out and relate this paper to the larger field of Islam, liberation theology, and human rights. When you look at what's been written in the field of Islamic liberation theology, when you take stock of the state of the art, there's a strong emphasis on certain categories over others. In terms of women, gender, and sexuality in Islam, we now have an extensive and highly sophisticated body of scholarship. We also have excellent work on religious pluralism and interfaith dialogue in Islam. And these are important, significant developments. We need even more critical scholarship on gender, sexuality, and religious pluralism in Islam. But there are also categories of oppression that have been neglected in the field. Social class and race have received scant attention, and so has the question of indigenous rights. To clarify, there has been extensive scholarship on occupied Palestine and Islamic resistance movements, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth. And there's also been extensive scholarship on Western Empire in the Muslim world. But the problem of settler colonialism itself as a category hasn't been theologically engaged. The dispossession of Aboriginal peoples as a category hasn't been addressed. Let me give my own example. I grew up in Vancouver in the 1990s and 2000s, and I grew up in a very devout Muslim household. The Muslim community held tons of events about Palestine and the Israeli occupation, and rightly so. But in my experience, not once did we hold an event for the indigenous peoples of the lands, the Coast Salish peoples. Not once did we acknowledge as a community that we actually live on unceded Coast Salish territory. So on this map here, you can see how historic Coast Salish lands actually extend across fabricated borders between Canada and the US. You can see how Canada in the north and the US in the south occupy historic Coast Salish lands. We often talk about the movement of people across borders. We talk a lot less about how borders cut across people and their lives and their lifeways. Now, I'm mindful that the discourse in Canada amongst Muslims has somewhat shifted since 2008. 2008 to 2015, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in which Canada looked in the mirror and actually acknowledged to some degree its acts of crime and violence committed against Indigenous peoples. So I'm aware that the discourse has shifted, but I'm speaking to my own lived experience growing up in the Muslim community in the 1990s and 2000s. As a result of settler colonialism and decade upon decade upon decade of institutionalized racism, the Indigenous people of Canada are now the poorest and the most vulnerable group in the country. And the same can be said of the Native peoples of the United States and Australia, both of which significantly have large and established Muslim communities. Let me give a few statistics on the Canadian context. As you can see, I'm a scholar who likes to cite my sources, So these stats come from the Poverty Institute of Canada, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and the United Nations Chronicle. 25% of Indigenous people in Canada live below the poverty line. And that problem is exacerbated for children. 4 in 10, or 40% of Native children live under the poverty line. In terms of gender, Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to get murdered or go missing than other Canadian women, and we're 16 times more likely than white Canadian women. Indigenous women are also 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than non-Indigenous women. And in terms of incarceration, Indigenous people make up about 20% of the Canadian prison population, even though in terms of the wider Canadian population, they constitute only 3%. So their prison numbers are 7 times higher than they should be proportionate to the population at large. And yet, despite this reality on the ground, and despite all our excellent social justice work for occupied Palestine, Indigenous peoples were never on our Canadian Muslim radar. And that's what I mean when I say that settler colonialism and Indigenous rights as categories haven't received sufficient attention in Islamic thought. And this is the larger contribution of this paper. The conquest of Canaan is arguably the biggest scriptural challenge that decolonial Jewish and Christian theologians have had to grapple with. By engaging the representation of Canaan in my own scripture, I'm trying to kickstart a larger conversation about Native American rights in Islam, about what it means to be a devout Muslim in a settler colonial context. Thank you.